AI is clearly a revolutionary technology, perhaps like no other. The investment in AI so far has been absolutely outstanding. People have invested about $500 billion cumulatively in AI. That includes the infrastructure, that includes the hardware, that includes the learning models, that includes the data, and so on and so forth. That's about 10x more than what was invested in the internet at about the same time since the inception and breakout of that technology. So you can see that there's a lot of excitement about AI. However, at the same time that the AI, let's call them experts or professionals, are investing like crazy in AI, the general public does not share their enthusiasm. So if we look at surveys that were done recently, Gallup says that 64% of the general public resists using AI as long as possible, versus only 35% embrace using AI as soon as possible. In another survey, Pew Research suggests that there's a chasm between how experts view AI and how the general public does. 56% of experts view AI positively, but only 17% of the general public views AI positively. And 47% of AI experts versus only 11% of the US population say that they are more excited than concerned about AI. So we can see that there's a big difference between those who work in AI versus those who are not about whether it's going to be a good thing for us. In fact, this very issue was mentioned just in the past week in the All In podcast that features a lot of very successful venture capitalists and investors and people who work in industries that are related to AI. And their recommendations were like, well, let's have AI companies like Google, like OpenAI, like Grok, etc., do some public service, use their money for the public good. For example, they were using the example of the Gilded Age, where American industrialists, this is the big move forward in American industry in the 19th century, where industrialists such as Andrew Carnegie donated and created libraries across the United States. In fact, Andrew Carnegie created about 5,000 libraries across the United States. Or John D. Rockefeller, at the time the world's richest man, created a foundation that still exists today. And they said these altruistic actions will help people in general, the average person, see AI more positively. As a psychologist, as an expert in psychology, I would say absolutely not. This will not improve public sentiment about the entrepreneurs of today. In fact, all of these good works, however admirable they were, did not improve sentiment about the entrepreneurs of that time. Of course, at that time, they weren't called entrepreneurs, but now we call them entrepreneurs. Even to this day, history books are filled with derogatory terms for some very, very successful people who, if you look about economically, have definitely advanced the living standards of many, many, many Americans and people in general. So nowadays, we hear Andrew Carnegie and we hear John D. Rockefeller, and we associate the term robber baron with those people who are, quote unquote, robbing the average person. Is it true? Is it not? I will not get into this in this video. However, what's obvious is that for all their philanthropic and altruistic actions with the money that they've earned with their companies, they did not earn positive sentiment from the average person. So I would humbly suggest that doing things altruistically is not what AI companies should do to get mainstream acceptance. So let's use actual psychology and try to understand what AI companies should do to gain mainstream acceptance and positive sentiment from the average person. Let's go. So first off, we should acknowledge that there are real concerns about AI. Bias is a big one. We all remember the disastrous launch of Gemini, the Google version of AI that was completely and ridiculously biased in its result. Also, there's inaccuracies in AI. There's a lot of hallucinations that AI makes, and a lot of companies such as Deloitte have encountered problems with that. Many people see existential risk with AI. They fear that AI and the robots that it would empower will take over us, potentially. There's also concerns about privacy, how the AI companies use the data that we give them, and finally, job displacement. A lot of people, the concern is, might lose their job. So obviously, there are reasons for the public to be scared or at least cautious about AI. Now, we're focusing on public sentiment, so the average person, how they feel about the technology, not the expert sentiment. This is because Just like movie critics see movies differently than the average person, so it is with AI. So experts care about over or under investment. They care about technical limitation, and they care about the bleeding edge of AI. What can be done at the absolute top of the industry, top of the technology, whereas the average person doesn't care about that at all, almost never. So we want to focus on the average public sentiment here. The average person matters because they will ultimately determine how and how much AI will be used in the real world. For a technology to be world-changing, many people, in fact, the majority of the world needs to adopt it. Moreover, the general public is the body that will vote for politicians who make different promises about laws related to AI. I mean, there are politicians that want to stunt the growth of AI, and there are politicians that want to encourage the growth of AI. And so if public sentiment is negative, then politicians who are restrictive will be voted in, whereas if AI sentiment is positive, then politicians who are encouraging for the technology will be voted in. And that's why the general public really matters. So let's get started. So how should we think about improving public sentiment for AI? Well, all the way in the 1960s, there was a sociologist who wrote a book called The Diffusion of Innovations Theory. Okay, and that theory explains how people adopt new technologies, new products, new services. There are several facets to that theory, but what really is relevant to us is that it separates the public into different segments of the population based on how quickly they adopt a product or service. And it turns out that these different segments have very different characteristics. The early adopters are very different from the late adopters, from the skeptics. And so our strategy when we want people to adopt anything, AI in particular, should be different depending on what segment we're targeting. So what happened is that adoption of a new product or service starts slow. And it starts with a very specific segment that's the innovators or the early adopters. And they have very specific motivations and needs that that product fulfills. And then it moves on through the majority and follows a predictable pattern based on reduced uncertainty about the product. People are less uncertain about what this product can do. And social influence, meaning people are conforming to others and they see others use the product and therefore they use it too. Now, it's important to note that not every product reaches the promised land of universal adoption, and the adoption is not linear. Although we expect products to be adopted linearly as time goes by, more and more people in a straight line adopt the product, it's actually not linear. It takes a long time to build adoption, to build a critical mass. And so for a long time, adoption is very low. This is why the very fast adoption of AI so far has been so amazing, because usually what we see is a long time takes until we see critical mass for new products. So in the original model, there are 5 different segments of the population. We're going to simplify that because we don't need unnecessary complexity. We just need to understand the differences in how we should approach and convince different segments of the population to adopt AI. And we don't need the nuances. We just need the main idea. So the segments we're going to care about are the early adopters. These are the people who are gung-ho about AI to begin with. The early majority, which is a bigger segment that comprises not only of the early adopters, but also of people who are not so excited about AI, but then have adopted it and incorporated it into their everyday life. And finally, the late majority, which is the real skeptics, the people who have ill will or distrust for AI, and they're going to be our largest segment, and they're going to come last. So let's think about where AI is now. So I would say AI is now in between early adopters and early majority by my assessment. Now, a lot of people actually use AI out there, but much of it is not through deliberate choice. And this is why I would put AI in this position. So for example, YouTube, where you're probably watching this video, the algorithm uses AI to refine the choices. And probably your email service, the one that whatever it is that you're using, is using AI to help you write your emails. But that's not you going out there and going out of your way to use AI and pay for it specifically. And so AI would really be adopted by the majority of the population when they pay specifically for it, rather than it being incorporated into products that you already use. So right now, the estimation is that there are between 70 to 100 million paid subscribers to OpenAI and Grok and Anthropic and Perplexity, that's hard to say. And so this is the core users of AI right now, okay? And we're thinking that the addressable market is probably anyone with an internet connection. So that's a big percentage of the world, okay? So that's what I'm saying. It's between early adoption and early majority. So let's think about the early adopters. So we're gonna ballpark it between 2.5% to 15% of the population. So why are the early adopters, why are they into the product? Well, they're not necessarily there because of its usefulness. I mean, there needs to be some usefulness for the product, but that's not the main goal, okay? They have an identity as avant-garde, as a maverick, as an innovator. And that's part of the reason, a big part, why they are using the product. They love talking about it. They love telling their friends and family and acquaintances that they're using a very new product. They also are there because it's cool and interesting. It's very interesting to use a new product. You're the first one on the block to use it. And finally, some of them are simply entrepreneurs who are trying to discover a business or income-producing ideas opportunistically in this new technology that other people have not found out about. So their motivation, the early adopters, is to create and lead a social group and to form a social identity as a maverick, okay? So what's good about it from the perspective of AI, from the perspective of people who want AI to be adopted widely? Well, early adopters are very motivated to spread the word proactively about AI. And so that can be used as a resource. However, it's important to know that there's a big perspective-taking difference between the early adopters and everybody else. Early adopters might be enamored by the coolness and how interesting the AI is, and they might be interested in their own identity, and they might be interested in talking about themselves using AI and so on. But people in the other segments, the late majority especially, are not that interested in being cool, and they don't want an identity of being an early adopter. And so if you're a proponent of AI, if you want AI to be adopted, you want to use the pro while avoiding the con. And the way to do that is to definitely use the motivation to spread the word from early adopters, but to direct them to spread the word specifically to people that they already know and who already trust them. In other words, you don't want the early adopters to spend their energy talking about AI to people that they don't know, because the reasons that the early adopters would put forth as, yes, we should adopt AI, are not the reasons that the early majority and the late majority would adopt AI. What you want is an early adopter who already knows someone to go to them and say, hey, you should subscribe to Anthropic, you should subscribe to OpenAI, because then the reason that that person would subscribe is because they already trust that person. It would be a personal reason rather than because AI is cool or because AI is the new wave and so on. You want to use personal connection, and you want to use the motivation of early adopters to spread the word. Okay, so let's understand now the early majority. Now, these are people who would adopt the technology because of the practical benefit, because of the reliability of that technology. They also want to see other people use it successfully. So they need social proof from other people. Hey, you're using it successfully. Okay, so I guess I'll try it. Okay. So the pros from an AI perspective, again, if you take the perspective of somebody who wants to spread AI as quickly as possible, well, the early majority are open to adopt if the technology is helpful for their work and for their leisure. Okay. They also serve, this segment of early majority serves as a key test for whether the technology can work for a broad market. So these are important pros of early majority. However, the con is that AI right now is too broad in a way. It's so broad that it has so many applications, it could be used in so many ways, that in and of itself, paradoxically, ironically, is a barrier to adoption from the early majority, okay? There are so many potential uses that strangely, it's almost like AI has no uses, okay? So what do I mean by that? So let's think about some of the uses that AI can help you with, and that's just scratching the surface. So AI can help you learn a language, create a workout routine, research an article, come up with ideas for an advertisement, write a toast in a dinner party, help you search for a used car to buy, transcribe a video, program a day trading algorithm, and so on and so forth. I can go on forever. We are spoiled for choice for AI, and that's not necessarily a good thing when it comes to product adoption, okay? There is something called in psychology choice overload, which is if you have an extensive ability to make different choices, that might seem attractive, but ultimately it might reduce the likelihood of making a decision altogether. Okay, so I might want to have all the choice in the world before I go into a store. Let's say I want to buy a car and I want to have 50 different types of cars that I can buy from. But when I'm actually in the store, I'm more likely to be overwhelmed by all the choices and therefore less motivated to actually make a decision and be satisfied with it. So there's a very famous experiment that was done in the year 2000 where people came into a grocery store and they were asked to taste different types of jams. In one condition, on one particular day, the people in the grocery store were faced with 6 different flavors of jam. And on another day, the people in the grocery store on that day faced 24 flavors of the jam. So more choices led more people to stop by that table and try the jam. 60% actually stopped by when there were 24 flavors compared to 40% when there were 6 flavors. So more choice is attractive in theory, but 30% of people bought the jam when they had only 6 flavors because they were actually able to try out all the flavors. Only 3% bought the jam when there were 24 flavors. So in other words, choice is attractive in theory, but in practice, too much choice is bad for product adoption. So more options of how to use a product is not always better, especially when it comes to a new technology that you want to incorporate into your everyday life, especially when you're not that motivated to adopt it. You are in the early majority, you're not an early adopter. So yes, you can do many, many things with AI, but unless you're super motivated to do trial and error with it, you kind of need someone to hold your hand and make the application super easy, kind of like an app on an iPhone does. So there needs to be an agent, whether it's a custom GPT or a company or an influencer or somebody that helps you out with each application of AI. So for example, you might need a personal trainer to tell you how to use AI to create your workout plan. You might need a language teacher to help you learn a new language with AI. It could be a language teacher as a person, or it could be a language teacher that creates a custom GPT or custom AI agent to do that. Doesn't matter. You might need a professional trader to help you with the day trading algo, and so on and so forth. These middlemen are there to simplify AI for you if you're in the early majority, so that it's a turnkey application, so that as a customer, you don't need to encounter friction to use the product. So for the early majority, and that's a very important segment of the population, that's a key test for AI, simplified application of AI to specific needs of that segment. It might seem like a very straightforward application. Just tell ChatGPT to create a training plan for you and you'll be done. But doing that means you are telling the customer to do all the work of discovering how to use a product themselves. And people in the early majority are not going to want to do that. So having a middleman, having an agent who will enable you to know how to use GPT for your own needs in life is the key to make early majority people willing to adopt the product. Okay, so now we're coming to the late majority. This is, I would say, 51% to 85% of the population, or even 90 or 95%, and we're just gonna leave the last 10% of laggards as very expensive to actually harness to our cause, and maybe we don't want to necessarily focus on them. But the late majority is a very big group, obviously, and their motivation to adopt is necessity and economic pressure. The technology is so good for specific needs that they have no choice but adopt it. They are motivated by these practical needs, and because their current solution or the current product becomes so obsolete and so unaffordable that they have to adopt. Let's think about what this segment is. This is a very big segment, and it obviously represents a lot of value for AI companies to capture. That's the pro from an AI perspective, from the proponents of AI's perspective. However, the con is think about it, this is the late majority. This is a hardened opposition, very hard to convert. These are the people who think that AI is bad, it's risky, it is a danger to your privacy, it may take over the world if we're not careful, and generally they're just not into it. Okay, so you have to get over a very big hump with those people. Okay, so if you've ever tried to convince somebody who's very recalcitrant to change their opinion, you would realize how difficult it is, and perhaps that it's not worth your time to do that. And in psychology, the solution to that is not to even try, but rather let people try to convince themselves. And how do you do that? Well, you just do. There's no need to convince. You just get people in the late majority, people who are skeptics, to use one specific application of AI without trying to convince them of the merits of the technology, preferably without even calling it AI. So let me give you an example of what I mean when I say this. So let's take a company called Zappos. This is a company that sells shoes online from a warehouse. And that company was very successful. It was actually purchased by Amazon about 15 to 20 years ago. And this is the way that they engendered commitment by their new employees. So they recruited employees. They wanted to have low turnover. They don't want a lot of people to quit because there's a lot of cost to hiring and training new employees. And this is, as you can imagine, not the most interesting job in the world necessarily, is working in a warehouse and sorting shoes and getting them ready to ship. So the way that they did it is they had training, regular training for new employees. And that training was about 4 weeks. And into the first or second week, they gave each new hire what they called the offer, which was an offer of a free $2,000 to quit the company at that point, no questions asked. So if you're a new employee, you come in, you start training, and the company tells you, if you want, here's $2,000, you can quit, no questions asked, the money is yours for free, no more work needed. Now, why would they do that? Think about the psychological effects of that offer. That money is not high enough to make most people quit, but it's high enough that you think about it. And the reality is that about 97% of people did not quit, did not take the offer, and stayed with Zappos, didn't take the free $2,000. But the act of refusing free money makes you more committed to the company. And it doesn't take a PowerPoint presentation about why the company is amazing, and it doesn't take a discussion of the vision of the company and the values of the company, and it doesn't take the CEO meeting every person in person, one-on-one, to explain to them how the company is so great. It's just getting people to do something that's in line with commitment to the company. Refusing free money is not something that we do on a regular basis. And so people would tell themselves, the new hires would tell themselves, if I said no to free money, then I must be very committed to this company. I must be very committed to Zappos, to working here. And this is an example of taking somebody and not trying to convince them with arguments, but rather telling them to do something that's in line with the position that you want them to be convinced of. And by them doing something, they are saying to themselves, I probably am into this company because otherwise, why would I refuse free money? In other words, they convince themselves. Okay, so let's try to implement this in our case. So engaging in the behavior of implementing AI over time will help the late majority convince themselves that AI is not so bad. The way to do that is to start small and to try to find an application for each, let's say, subsegment of the late majority that they can use AI and be very successful, have it be very useful, no risk, no uncertainty about the usefulness of the product. And by using an AI more and more, their objection to AI would melt away over time. This does not require debates about whether AI is a good thing or a bad thing, because those debates will likely not be constructive with somebody who's very resistant, who's very skeptical of adopting AI. So with the late majority, what we want is them to implement AI in a small way, and then over time, they will become more moderate and in effect convince themselves that AI is not so bad. Okay, so there you have it. This is a roadmap for AI adoption. We don't need to build libraries in different cities. We don't need altruism. We don't need philanthropic organizations. We don't need anything. We just need a little bit of psychology. Early adopters want to be ambassadors of the new technology. So you have to channel this energy, but you have to channel it right. Get early adopters to make referrals, not based on their excitement for the product, but based on trustworthy reasons, which is personal referrals, rather than a not so good reason, which is just lofty vision and emotion that early adopters have, but nobody else has. The early majority wants practical benefits, so get the early majority to see specific uses of AI through middlemen who can introduce them to the technology and enable them to use it in a successful way. What you want is the early majority to easily be able to get their heads around the usefulness of the technology. And finally, the late majority is the most skeptical. So get the late majority just to simply use AI in a small way without discussing the pros and cons of the technology, because they'll be more attracted to the cons than the pros. That's why they're in the late majority. So All In Podcast, besties, no need to thank me. I'm doing this as a labor of love, but also everybody else. I hope this shows you how we can use basic psychology to help solve key business problems. I hope this was helpful. Stick around for the next one. Bye-bye.